$80,000 a year. Say that out loud for a second. Your parents raised an entire family on less than that, bought a house, took vacations, had savings. And yet, right now, in 12 states across this country, $80,000 a year officially qualifies your household as financially struggling. Not poor, not broke, struggling by the government's own numbers. So where did the money go? And why is no one in the mainstream news talking about this? I dug into the data named cost of living indices, median housing burdens, childcare cost, healthcare premiums, transportation, and what I found will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about what it means to be doing okay in America. Stay with me. Because if you live in one of these states, this video might be the most important 12 minutes of financial reality you'll watch this year. Here's what we're actually measuring, and why it matters. The federal poverty line is a joke. We all know that. It was designed in 1963 based on food costs, and it hasn't kept pace with reality since the Nixon administration. But there's a better metric. It's called the self-sufficiency standard, developed by researchers at the University of Washington, and it calculates the actual income a household needs to meet its basic expenses without public assistance and without going into debt. No vacations, no savings, no emergencies, just the basics: housing, food, childcare, healthcare, transportation, taxes. When you run that formula through current 2024 data, something alarming jumps out. In 12 states where the median household income hovers around $75,000 to $85,000, a family of 4 earning $80,000 a year falls below the self-sufficiency threshold. That's not a political opinion. That's arithmetic. And the gap is widening every single year. So let's count them down, from bad to genuinely shocking, starting with number 12. We're going to move through 12 states today. Some will surprise you, some will confirm what you already suspected, and at least one will make you genuinely angry. We've got a Pacific Coast state where child care alone consumes nearly a quarter of that $80,000 salary. We've got a Sunbelt state that sold itself as an affordable paradise and quietly became anything but. And we've got one state saved for last, where the math is so broken, so completely inverted, that I almost didn't believe the numbers when I first pulled them. You'll want to see that one. Let's start the countdown. Number 12, Virginia. And if you're thinking, Virginia? That's not that expensive. That's exactly what I thought too until I looked at where most Virginians actually live. Here's the trap. Virginia markets itself as a moderate cost state. And if you live in the far southwest, near the Kentucky border, that's probably true. But nearly 40% of Virginia's entire population lives in the northern Virginia suburbs, Fairfax County, Arlington, Loudoun County, which have been economically annexed by Washington, D.C. And D.C. doesn't do affordable. The median home price in Fairfax County right now sits around $650,000. The average 2-bedroom apartment in Arlington, $2,800 a month. That's $33,600 a year in rent alone, before utilities, before food, before a single diaper gets bought. Now run the child care numbers. In Virginia, full-time infant care averages $18,000 a year per child. 2 kids, and you're looking at $36,000 in child care on top of that rent. Add transportation, because Northern Virginia's public transit doesn't reach most of the suburbs worth living in, and you're adding $10,000 to $15,000 in car costs annually. The self-sufficiency standard for a family of 4 in Fairfax County, $142,000 a year on $80,000. You're not just struggling. You're running a $62,000 annual deficit against basic needs. What makes Virginia particularly insidious is that the state knows this. The Northern Virginia region generates enormous tax revenue, but the affordability crisis there has been quietly ignored by Richmond for decades because the people suffering most are younger families and working-class households, not the donor class. And those young families, they're leaving. Net domestic outmigration from Northern Virginia has been accelerating since 2021. They're heading to the Shenandoah Valley, to West Virginia, to the Carolinas. The irony? The very Amazon HQ2 deal that was supposed to bring prosperity to the region added $50,000 to the median home price in the surrounding zip codes within 18 months of the announcement. Progress, they called it. Next up, a state that people are flooding into, which is exactly why it made this list. Number 11. Colorado. This one genuinely hurts because Colorado used to be one of the great American value propositions. Mountains, a clean air, a booming tech economy, reasonable cost of living relative to California. Notice I said used to. Between 2010 and 2023, Colorado's population grew by over 14%. That sounds like success. And it was for anyone who owned property in 2010. For everyone else, it was a slow-motion squeeze. Denver's median home price has more than tripled since 2012. The metro area's average rent crossed $1,900 a month back in 2022 and hasn't looked back. And here's the detail that doesn't make the headlines. Colorado's property tax system, historically very low, has been struggling to keep up with assessed values that have skyrocketed, meaning the tax bills are now catching up to the sticker shock too. But the real killer in Colorado is healthcare. Colorado has some of the highest individual health insurance premiums in the country for people who don't get employer coverage. The average unsubsidized bronze plan for a 45-year-old in Colorado in 2024, over $600 a month. Silver plan, close to $800. For a family of 4, you're looking at $15,000 to $20,000 per year in health insurance premiums before you've paid a single copay. Now do the math on $80,000. Rent, $22,800. Healthcare, $18,000. Childcare, Colorado's average is around $17,000 per child per year, making it the 4th most expensive state. $34,000 for 2 kids. Transportation in a car-dependent metro, $12,000. You've spent $86,800 before you've bought groceries. The self-sufficiency standard for Denver Aurora confirms it. A family of 4 needs approximately $137,000 a year to meet basic needs without assistance. $80,000 misses that mark by $57,000. What's the response from Colorado's political class? Affordable housing legislation that real estate interests have systematically watered down? A property tax relief bill that barely moves the needle for working families? And here's the dark irony everyone in Denver talks about, but no one fixes. The transplants who moved from California to escape California's costs have now recreated California's cost structure in Denver. Congratulations. You've turned your escape route into the thing you were running from. Number 10 takes us somewhere warm and expensive in ways you wouldn't expect. Number 10, Florida. I can already hear the comments. Florida. But everyone's moving to Florida because it's affordable. Here's the thing about Florida. The people moving to Florida are, in many cases, either arriving with California equity, New York bonuses, or remote tech salaries that dwarf $80,000. They're not the measure of affordability. They're the engine of unaffordability. And for the people actually from Florida, the teachers, the nurses, the hospitality workers, the retirees on fixed incomes who've lived there for decades, the state has become a financial ambush. Let's start with what no one told you about Florida's cost structure. Florida has no income tax. True. But what Florida has instead is a home insurance crisis, so severe it makes the national news every 6 months and then gets quietly forgotten. The average homeowner's insurance premium in Florida in 2024 is approximately $6,000 per year. In Miami-Dade, closer to $9,000 to $11,000. And that's if you can find a carrier willing to insure you at all. Several major insurers have outright left the state. Others are non-renewing policies mid-coverage cycle. For a homeowner on $80,000 a year, home insurance alone consumes 7.5% to 14% of gross income. That's before the mortgage. And the mortgage? Miami's median home price is now over $600,000. Tampa? Still north of $380,000 after the post-peak pullback. Orlando sits around $370,000. Then there's the hidden tax that Florida doesn't advertise. Sales tax is applied aggressively, and combined with local surtaxes, you're looking at 6% to 8% on most purchases, including grocery items in many counties. No income tax, but you'll pay for it at the register, at the insurance agent, and every time a hurricane season reminds you that living in paradise has a deductible. Here, the self-sufficiency standard for Miami-Dade puts a family of 4 at roughly $118,000 needed annually for basic self-sufficiency. For Tampa, closer to $106,000. Both are well above $80,000. And for retirees, the people Florida has been marketed to for 60 years, Social Security doesn't cover the insurance premiums. Medicare doesn't cover what it used to. And the equity in your Midwest home that was supposed to fund your golden years is getting eaten alive by carrying costs you were never warned about. This is why Florida's in-migration numbers after 3 years of record arrivals are starting to soften. People are arriving, doing the math, and quietly reconsidering. Coming up, a state that's been telling everyone to move there, while quietly becoming one of the hardest places in America to actually afford to live in. Number 9, Texas. And I know, half of you just sat up straighter. The other half are nodding because you already know what's coming. Texas has been the great American relocation pitch for a decade. No income tax, business-friendly, big sky, friendly people, reasonable cost of living. Some of that is still true. If you're moving to Lubbock or Abilene or Wichita Falls, Texas may still deliver on the promise. But if you're moving to, or already living in, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, or San Antonio, the math has shifted dramatically. Let's start with property taxes. Because this is where Texas quietly picks your pocket. Texas funds its public services largely through property taxes because there's no state income tax. The result? Texas has some of the highest effective property tax rates in the country. In Travis County, Austin, Emory, the effective rate is roughly 1.8% to 2.1% on a $450,000 home, which is below Austin's current median. That's $8,100 to $9,450 per year in property taxes, on top of a mortgage payment that, at current interest rates, runs roughly $2,600 to $2,900 a month on that $450,000 purchase. So you're paying $31,200 to $35,800 a year just in mortgage and property taxes, before insurance, before utilities, and then there's February 2021, which Texas has apparently decided to simply move past. The 2021 winter storm that knocked out the power grid for millions of Texans didn't just cost lives. It revealed that Texas's deregulated energy market creates enormous financial volatility for consumers. Electricity bills in Texas average higher than most people expect for a warm weather state, partly because HVAC systems work harder in extreme heat, and partly because deregulated markets don't always deliver the savings they promised. Summer electricity bills of $300 to $500 per month in Austin are not unusual for a family home. Now run the full family of four budget in Austin on $80,000. The self-sufficiency standard for Travis County, approximately $132,000 per year. $80,000 misses by $52,000. The cruelest part of the Texas story? The people who were priced out of California moved to Texas for affordability and are now finding that Austin has become, in many neighborhoods, more expensive than the San Diego suburbs they left. The arbitrage closed, and they're still paying California-style prices, but now with Texas-style infrastructure vulnerability. Number 8. A state that quietly crept onto this list while everyone was looking the other way. Number 8. Georgia, specifically the Atlanta metropolitan area, which now encompasses roughly 6 million people and an ever-expanding ring of suburbs with price tags that would have seemed impossible 10 years ago. Georgia has been the quiet success story of the Southeast for the last decade. Netflix moved production here. Microsoft, Apple, and Google have major presences. The film and TV industry has made Atlanta one of the most active production hubs in the world, which locals love until they realize what production money does to rental markets. The average one-bedroom apartment in Midtown Atlanta is now over $1,800 a month. The outer suburbs, Alpharetta, Johns Creek, Smyrna, have median home prices comfortably above $400,000. But here's what makes Georgia particularly rough for working families. Georgia's childcare infrastructure is among the weakest in the Southeast. There aren't enough licensed facilities to meet demand, which drives prices up through scarcity rather than luxury. You're paying premium prices for basic care because there simply aren't enough options. Average infant care in Metro Atlanta, $14,000 to $17,000 per child annually. Georgia also has notable gaps in employer-sponsored health care. The state rejected Medicaid expansion for years, finally accepting a modified version in 2023, leaving a large segment of working adults in coverage gaps or on expensive marketplace plans For a family of 4 in the Atlanta metro on $80,000, the self-sufficiency standard puts the number at approximately $108,000 to $118,000, depending on the county. Indeed, still a $28,000 to $38,000 gap against that $80,000 salary. What no one tells the people relocating to Georgia for its affordability. Atlanta's traffic infrastructure is so underdeveloped relative to its population that commuting by car is unavoidable for most families, and the average commuter in the metro area spends 80 to 90 hours per year stuck in traffic. That's lost productivity, lost time, and real fuel costs that don't show up in the glossy relocation brochures. Number 7 is a state that used to be the promised land of affordability. What happened there is a warning to every other state on this list. Number 7, Nevada. Specifically, and almost entirely, the Las Vegas metropolitan area, which is home to about 78% of Nevada's population. Here's the story that didn't make headlines. Las Vegas was, for decades, it's one of the most genuinely affordable major metro areas in America. Cheap land, no state income tax, housing that cost a fraction of what comparable square footage went for in Los Angeles, 2 states over. Then 2 things happened. 1, California's housing crisis hit critical mass, and hundreds of thousands of Californians crossed the state line, bringing their equity and their salary expectations with them. 2, remote work made it possible to collect a California paycheck while paying Nevada prices. The result was a market shock that hit Las Vegas faster and harder than almost any other city in the Sunbelt. Between 2019 and 2023, Las Vegas home prices increased by roughly 50%. The median home price, which sat below $300,000 as recently as 2019, crossed $430,000 in 2024. For a local worker, a casino hospitality employee, a warehouse worker at one of the major distribution hubs outside Henderson, a teacher in Clark County. That price appreciation was entirely disconnected from wage growth. Nevada's median household income sits around $65,000. For a family at $80,000, you'd think you're ahead of the curve. But the self-sufficiency standard for Clark County puts the true baseline for a family of 4 at approximately $101,000 to $110,000. And then there's the water problem, which doesn't show up in any cost of living index, but is quietly one of the most significant financial risks facing anyone who owns property in southern Nevada. Las Vegas gets nearly all of its water from Lake Mead. Lake Mead has been at historic low levels for 3 consecutive years. Nevada faces mandatory water restrictions from the Colorado River Compact. And the long-term question of whether Las Vegas can even sustain its current population, let alone grow, is something local officials talk around very carefully. What happens to property values in a desert city with a structural water supply problem? No one wants to answer that out loud. Number 6 takes us back to the coasts, with a story about a state that used to be paradise and is increasingly becoming a punchline. Number 6, Oregon. Portland, specifically, though the cost pressure has now spread to Salem Bend and even Eugene, which 10 years ago was genuinely affordable. Oregon has the distinction of being a state that simultaneously has enormous quality of life, no sales tax, yet some costs of living that have outpaced income growth so dramatically that middle-class families are being economically evicted from the cities they've lived in for generations. The average home price in the Portland metro, around $480,000 in 2024. Average one-bedroom apartment, $1,600 to $1,900 per month. Oregon has state income tax, up to 9.9% at the top bracket, and the brackets aren't indexed to inflation the way federal brackets are, meaning more middle-class earners have been quietly pushed into higher brackets through wage growth that didn't actually increase their purchasing power. Here's the piece that doesn't show up in the standard cost of living analysis. Oregon's utility costs, electricity and gas, have risen sharply due to a combination of aging infrastructure, the energy transition, and drought conditions affecting hydropower. Portland General Electric's rates have increased by over 40% in the last 4 years. For a family on $80,000, the self-sufficiency standard in Multnomah County puts the true requirement at approximately $124,000 per year, a $44,000 gap. And the social infrastructure that Oregon residents used to rely on to soften the cost burden, robust public services, accessible health care through the Oregon Health Plan, good public schools, has been strained by a decade of population growth that outpaced capacity. Oregon is one of the rare cases where the cost of living has risen dramatically and the quality of the publicly funded services you're supposed to rely on has declined simultaneously. You're paying more for less. The people leaving, mostly going to Idaho, Montana, and the smaller cities in eastern Oregon, places where $80,000 still means something. 5 states left. And the ones we haven't covered yet, they're where the math gets truly brutal. Number 5, Illinois. And before the Chicagoans click away, yes, this is primarily a Chicago story, but it's also a cautionary tale about what happens when a state's fiscal dysfunction directly becomes a cost of living crisis for working families. Illinois has been losing population for 9 consecutive years. Net domestic outmigration has consistently ranked among the highest in the nation. And yet, paradoxically, costs in the Chicago metro haven't collapsed the way you'd expect when demand is declining. Here's why. Illinois' pension crisis is real, massive, and being paid for in a very specific way. The Illinois has over $200 billion in unfunded pension liabilities, the largest as a percentage of state GDP in the country. Those liabilities are being funded through a combination of the highest property taxes in the nation. Illinois' effective property tax rate is roughly 2.08%, second only to New Jersey, and a patchwork of fees, taxes, and service reductions. In Cook County, a modest $350,000 home carries a property tax bill of approximately $7,000 to $9,000 per year. In the North Shore suburbs, Evanston, Wilmette, Winnetka, property taxes on a $600,000 home can exceed $15,000 annually. And unlike the western states where property taxes at least reflect some growth in home equity, in many Chicago neighborhoods, you're paying California-level property taxes on a home that hasn't appreciated meaningfully in a decade. For a family of 4 in the Chicago metro on $80,000, the self-sufficiency standard puts the real number at approximately $116,000 to $128,000, depending on the suburb. Illinois also has a flat state income tax, currently 4.95%, and Chicago City residents pay an additional 1.25% local tax. You're paying $4,800 in state income tax and nearly $1,000 in local tax off that $80,000 before you've written a single bill check. The deeply uncomfortable question that Illinois political leaders avoid: if the state continues to bleed population, the remaining residents bear an increasing share of an unfunded liability that doesn't shrink just because the tax base does. People leaving aren't solving the problem. They're concentrating it. Number 4, a West Coast state where the dream still sells, but the math died years ago. Number 4, Washington State, the home of Amazon, Microsoft, Boeing, Starbucks, and a cost of living crisis that the tech industry's enormous salaries have accidentally created for everyone who doesn't work in tech. Seattle's median home price has crossed $800,000. Bellevue, closer to $1.2 million. Even the exurbs, Renton, Kirkland, Kent, now carry median prices in the $600,000 to $750,000 range. Washington has no income tax, like Texas, like Nevada, like Florida, but Washington funds its services through a sales tax that is among the highest in the country. The combined state and local rate in Seattle is 10.25%. Every grocery run, every car repair, every appliance purchase, 10.25% on top. And Washington also recently enacted a capital gains tax and a long-term care payroll tax, the first of its kind in the country, which applies to workers' wages directly. Not a huge dollar amount at $80,000 in income, but a real signal that the no income tax pitch is getting qualified. The self-sufficiency standard for King County, and where Seattle sits, puts a family of 4 at approximately $145,000 per year to meet basic needs. On $80,000, the gap is $65,000, the second largest gap of any state on this list. And here's the detail that makes Washington unique among the states we've covered. The presence of the tech industry hasn't just driven up prices, it's created a two-tier economy so pronounced that workers in the same city, in the same neighborhoods, on the same streets, are living in fundamentally different financial realities based entirely on whether their employer is in the S&P 500. A teacher in Seattle making $75,000 and an Amazon software engineer making $250,000 plus stock comp are not living in the same city in any meaningful economic sense. But they're competing for the same housing. 3 states left. And the gap between $80,000 and what it actually costs to live is only going to grow. Number 3, Connecticut. Connecticut is a state of profound economic contradiction, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention in the national conversation about affordability. Connecticut is the wealthiest state in the country by per capita income. It is also a state with some of the most economically distressed cities in the Northeast: Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven, Waterbury, where median incomes have barely moved in inflation-adjusted terms for 20 years. The state's fiscal situation is similar to Illinois in structure: massive pension obligations, high property taxes, high income taxes. Connecticut's top state income tax rate is 6.99%, and a long-running population decline that accelerated sharply in 2020. Here's what makes Connecticut particularly punishing for a family at $80,000. Connecticut doesn't have one housing market, it has 2. Greenwich and Westport, commuter communities for Manhattan financial workers, have median home prices north of $1.5 million and $1.2 million, respectively. Drive 45 minutes north, and you're in communities with median prices of $200,000. But with school districts, infrastructure, and economic opportunity that explain why those prices are low. If you're a middle-income family trying to find the balance, decent schools, reasonable commute, not a $2 million mortgage, Connecticut puts you in a narrow band of communities where demand consistently outpaces supply. The self-sufficiency standard for Fairfield County, the affluent Southwest, puts a family of 4 at approximately $138,000. In Hartford County, it's closer to $105,000. Either way, $80,000 is well below the line. Connecticut also has among the highest healthcare costs per capita in the nation, and the state's electricity rates, regulated by a utility structure that's been criticized for decades, are consistently among the top 5 most expensive in the country. Your electricity bill in Connecticut in 2024 is not a rounding error. A family of 4 averages $2,400 to $3,600 per year in electric costs. He's before the heat comes on. Number 2, a state that is, by some metrics, the hardest in the entire country in which to afford a basic life, and yet remains one of the most desired destinations in America. Number 2, Massachusetts. Boston is now, by multiple cost indices, the 3rd or 4th most expensive major metro area in the United States. And unlike New York or San Francisco, where the conversation about affordability has been happening loudly for decades, Boston's transformation happened just recently enough that the mythology of the livable Northeast city hasn't fully updated. Here's the reality. The median home price in the Boston metro area crossed $700,000 in 2024. The average one-bedroom apartment in Boston proper, $2,900 to $3,400 per month. In Cambridge, where MIT and Harvard create perpetual demand from universities, biotech, and venture capital, average rents for a 2-bedroom can exceed $4,500 per month. Massachusetts has a flat state income tax of 5%, plus, as of 2023, a new 4% surtax on income over $1 million, which doesn't affect an $80,000 earner, but signals where policy attention is focused. It has a sales tax of 6.25%, and it has the highest average childcare costs in the country. Full-time infant care in the Boston metro averages $23,000 per year. For a family with 2 children in care, that's $46,000 per year. Before taxes, before rent, before a single car payment. The self-sufficiency standard for Suffolk County, Boston, puts a family of 4 at approximately $158,000 per year. The gap between $80,000 and what it actually costs to live a basic life in Boston, $78,000 per year. That is not a rounding error. And that is a second income that the data says you simply must have to survive in that city. And yet Boston continues to draw people because the universities produce graduates who stay, because the biotech and life sciences industries pay well, because the cultural and institutional quality of life is genuinely extraordinary. The cruelest irony of Massachusetts, its own public school teachers, its own nurses, its own city workers, the people who make the city function, can often no longer afford to live in the city they serve. Boston's teacher union surveyed its members in 2023. Over 30% reported living more than 30 miles from the schools where they taught because they couldn't afford to live any closer. That is a city consuming itself. And now, the state that beats all of them. The number one state on this list. It's just the place where $80,000 a year doesn't just make you struggle, it mathematically cannot cover a family's basic needs. Not even close. Number one, California. And I want to be precise here because California is enormous, and there is still real geographic variation within it. The Central Valley is significantly more affordable. Parts of the Inland Empire are hanging on. The far north, Redding, Red Bluff, is another world entirely. But California's story is defined by where 85% of its population actually lives. The Bay Area, Los Angeles, San Diego, and the major coastal metros. And in those places, the distance between $80,000 and what it actually costs to live has become so vast that it belongs in a different category from every other state on this list. Let me give you the numbers. Here's the median home price in the San Francisco Bay Area, $1.1 to $1.4 million, depending on the specific county. In Los Angeles, $870,000. In San Diego, over $900,000. Monthly rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, $3,600 to $4,800. Los Angeles, $3,200 to $4,200. San Diego, $3,000 to $3,800. California has the highest state income tax in the country, up to 13.3%, and the bracket creep means that $80,000 in California income is taxed at a meaningful effective state rate, taking roughly $4,500 to $5,500 off the top. California also has some of the highest gas prices in the country, regularly $1 to $1.50 per gallon above the national average, due to a state-specific fuel formulation requirement and carbon pricing mechanisms. And then there's childcare. Full-time infant care in the Bay Area averages $25,000 to $35,000 per year. You're per child. This is not a typo. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a story in 2023 about a family paying $4,200 per month for 2 children in licensed childcare, which, annualized, is $50,400 per year in childcare alone. On $80,000 gross, the self-sufficiency standard for San Francisco County for a family of 4, approximately $196,000 per year. For Los Angeles County, approximately $175,000 per year. The gap between $80,000 and what it costs to cover basic needs in San Francisco without going into debt, $116,000 per year, $116,000 per year. That is the size of the gap between sounds like good money and actually surviving in America's most economically productive state. And here's what makes California the definitive number one on this list. It's not just the scale of the gap. It's the duration and velocity of it. California's housing crisis is not new. Economists, policymakers, and housing advocates have been sounding the alarm for 30 years. And in 30 years of documented, quantified, thoroughly studied crisis, California has not built its way out. It has not taxed its way out. It has not regulated its way out. What it has done is export its crisis. The million-plus people who left California between 2020 and 2023 took their housing equity, their salary benchmarks, and their cost expectations to Nevada, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Florida. And those are the states sitting below California on this very list. California is not just failing its own residents. It's the engine of unaffordability for the entire Western Sunbelt. And the people being left behind, the teachers on $68,000 a year. You got the social workers on $55,000. The restaurant workers, the warehouse staff, the small business owners who can't pack up and move. They are not struggling because they made bad choices. They are struggling because the gap is real. It is documented, and it has been deliberately allowed to grow for 3 decades by people who owned property and had no financial incentive to solve a crisis that was, for them, an asset. 12 states. 12 places where earning $80,000 a year, what your parents would have called a comfortable income, now officially means you're falling behind. Not because you spent too much, not because you didn't work hard enough, because the gap between income and actual costs has been quietly growing for decades, while the official story told you things were fine. Now you know the real numbers. Ray, if this changed how you see your own state, or the state you're thinking about moving to, hit that like button and drop a comment. Tell me where you're at, what you're paying, and whether these numbers match what you're actually living. And if you're starting to ask yourself where $80,000 still means something, it's where you can actually afford to live, retire, or start over, that's exactly what my next video covers. Because there are states, real, livable, genuinely affordable states, where the math works in your favor. Subscribe so you don't miss it. I'll see you in the next one.